Thank you so much. I'm Chris Knopp, the Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. We have a very special Lunch with the Friends program today, uplifting Indigenous voices in the Minnesota Legislature. We have Representative Heather Keeler from Moorhead with us and Senator Mary Kunesh from New Brighton. Mary Kunesh represents Senate District 39, and she's of Standing Rock Sioux Tribe heritage. She's been in the state Senate since 2020, and before that, she served in the Minnesota House of Representatives, being elected in 2016. Heather Keeler represents District 4A, Moorhead. She's of Yankton. She's an enrolled member of the Yankton Sioux Tribe, and also has a lineage to the Eastern Shoshone Tribe as well. She was elected in 2020, and Heather grew up in South Dakota, and she's and appropriately enough, she spearheaded the city of Moorhead officially recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day. So Heather has been very active in this space for many years, and she has served as the Assistant Director of Multicultural Recruitment at North Dakota State University. I am so grateful that both of you are here at Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. We're trying to be a better organization and have a better allyship. For some of you out there, you may know that before coming to the Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, worked for an organization called the Indian Land Tenure Foundation that works on native land recovery within reservation boundaries here. Over the past year, we at the Friends most recently did some wild ricing with the Fond du Lac tribe in the early part of September here, and we've been on a sacred sites tour here in the metro area, and have had presentations on the Indian Child Welfare Act and the 1854 Treaty. And so we are striving to be a better organization and have true allyship and not just be performative. And so we're really trying to move to that next layer, and we know that we have a long way to go. This has been a really extraordinary time for projecting and putting forth Native rights and responsibilities. Representative Keeler and Mary Kunesh are joining the legislature with Representative Alicia Kozlowski and Representative Jamie Becker-Finn, as well as Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. And so there were some extraordinarily important legislation passed in the last session here. And what I'd like to do, perhaps maybe beginning for both Senator Kunesh and Representative Keeler, maybe talk about your experience serving in the Minnesota Legislature and uplifting your voice and perspective, and just provide some context for the work that you do. And so maybe I'll start off with Senator Kunesh. If you start off with that and respond to that question, and just provide context for us this afternoon.
Well, thank you for this invitation. I'm happy to meet and talk about these really important issues. I came into the legislature, into the House in 2017, having been an educator, a library media specialist for 25 years. And if it's one thing I know, across almost any topic, there's so much to learn and so much to understand. And I felt that by being an elected official at the state legislature, I'd have an opportunity to bring some of the things that I care most about to the legislature. And so education, of course, is a top one. The environment, absolutely. I grew up in what was then the village of Sartell, where the Mississippi River and the Watab Creek met. And we lived our lives on the river, on the creek, in the woods, with our farm friends. So the environment and how we take care of it, especially when it comes to agriculture, is really, really important. So I'm really proud to be the chair of Education Finance in the Senate, but I'm also really proud to sit on the Ag Committee, as well as one of the environmental committees. But as a descendant of the Lakota Nation, I grew up with learning those values of what it means to be a good steward, not just of the earth, but of each other. And those are the values and the morals and the goals that I bring to the legislature. And, you know, if you look back over the last 7 years, not just because I've been there, but because the growing number of Native legislators who are advocating for really important things, we have been incredibly successful if you add it all up. And it really makes a difference when we have allies such as all of you here when we are doing this work.
So much, Senator Kunesh. And Representative Keeler?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for hosting this. It's kind of interesting. My son is playing his senior night football game, so I had to switch gears back to like legislative talk from like football mom talk. So hello, everyone. Yep, I'm Heather Keeler. I was elected in the middle of the pandemic, so I think that kind of makes my story and my class's story a little bit different. Politics was never something I was interested in. Actually, what happened was I grew up off the reservation. My family left right before I was born, and my mom worked for the state of South Dakota working to implement the Medicaid program. So I grew up watching my mom go across the state of South Dakota, helping people get access to healthcare and really seeing what poverty looked like. You know, I saw it in my own family, but then I saw it in a lot of these other community members who looked like me. And then I grew up and a lot of my family members got sick because, as we know, Indigenous people, we have a shorter life expectancy for men and women. You know, we're dying in our early to mid 60s, and that statistic is very real in my family. And so as I watched my aunties and uncles and my dad get sick, and my niece had cancer, I looked at the healthcare system and saw that we didn't really have any doctors or nurses or social workers that looked like me. I went through my entire education career. I have 4 diplomas. I never had a teacher who looked like me. So I went into Indian education because I figured, kind of like Senator Kunesh said, you know, education is the tool, I believe, to reduce hate and harm in this world. When we know better, we should do better. And so I really got involved in Indian education. And that's when I learned going into people's living rooms and really having these engaging conversations. My master's practicum, I asked the question, what is the barrier to academic success outside of academic rigor? So I wasn't asking my community, is math or science hard? Like, what are the real things? And the top 3 things that came to mind in everybody's conversation was the lack of representation. And that meant, one, seeing us physically, but also in the curriculum, being accurate, what we see in the walls, what we smell in the hallways, what the languages we hear, the things that we attend and celebrate. And then the other 2 things were lack of housing and food insecurities. And as a liaison and as somebody who both my parents are Native, my kids are enrolled in my same tribe, I really believe in the 7-generation impact. And listening to the next generation tell me that those things mattered. When this seat came open, Ben Lean announced he was retiring like in February. And I, after learning that information about my school, I was going to run for school board. And I remember walking in and at the convention, everybody was going to, you know, do this endorsement process. And I looked around and it was like just a bunch of white straight men who were going to run for the seat again. And there was this like moment in my mind that I remember all of those people that I had talked to in my community at least deserved an option on the ballot of somebody who looked like them. And I don't know that I really thought I was going to win. You know, I thought I was just going to show up and have a voice and really challenge our community to some conversations. It's been really impactful. And so I've been able to go on and do a lot of work really around homelessness and food insecurities. I'm the vice chair of the Children and Families Committee in the House, and really made some historic investments this year in homelessness because that is kind of the foundation of all of us, along with all of the outstanding Indigenous work we've been able to do.
Would you expand on that legislation that you're so proud of dealing with homelessness and food insecurity? Why don't you talk about what that legislation is doing for us and for real people?
So so one of the first things we did was in March. And as I guess sometimes I have to go back and explain to people, like, what does the session even look like? You know, we go into session in January and we're done in May. And usually we have big packages and bills near the end of session. For us to get things off the House floor and get funding out into our communities in the middle of a March is not necessarily a common thing. So one of the first things we did was our emergency food shelves were running out of food. And we all know that it's state statute that says if you visit an emergency food shelf, you're required to leave with either 6 pounds of food or 2 days worth of food. Well, we didn't have that on the shelves. And we knew that with the prices of eggs and milk, and we all know what's been happening, you know, in the grocery stores lately, we really had to get that money out the door. And so it was a very bipartisan effort. And we moved it very quickly, and we got that money, $5 million, out into the community, border to border. There's an emergency food shelf in every single county. And so just things like that, you know, it's not these big glamorous things, but it's really making sure that our neighbors are fed. You know, I said it on the House floor. I bet we all ate something today, or at least last night. And working with kids, you know, when they're hungry, you don't learn well. When we're hangry, we know we don't function well as adults. And so we did that. But then the biggest thing was we got the Pathway Home Act through, which was a really braided structure. Again, kind of back to my teachings that being a braid is a way of strength. And so we increased the Youth Homeless Act, which is designed to support youth ages 24 and below. We made a massive increase in our emergency services. So those are like basically the bells and whistles inside our shelter programs that house people, to make sure that they can keep their air conditions working, they can pay their staff, they can have plumbing updates. Like, they're really just down to bare bones. But the biggest win was we got $100 million in shelter capital for the first time ever. And 40% of that is required to go to Greater Minnesota. And being somebody who serves in Greater Minnesota, it's really important to me that when we invest in Minnesota, that it really is the entire state in ways that are meaningful. And so that was huge. It was very much a House-led effort. I mean, it came from me sitting in a room thinking, like, how can we do something really big while we're in a trifecta? And just really pushing for it. And so I'm really proud of that work, because as we know, the #1 homeless population are Indigenous people. And so it's just a way to make sure we all have a home on our own homelands.
Great, thank you. So the legislation that you're so proud of, it benefits Native people, but it also has a broader impact in non-Native people into Greater Minnesota. And so this is so coming from that place, it has that expansive benefit to all people there. And that, and you know, there's some important legislation passed with respect to education, and Senator Kunesh, if you want to perhaps speak to some of that with your background in education and some of the really path-breaking work that was passed this past session dealing with access to higher education. If you please take it from there, I'd like to have your thoughts on that.
Sure. We did. We had an extraordinary session this year, investing in education from the very, very earliest all the way through to continuing ed and adult basic education. I myself recognize myself as a lifelong learner. I know there are so many people that have positive impact even as they age, the mental, the physical, the social, emotional well-being of our growing population really needs to be attended to. And so for the first time in many, many years, we put a lot of money into adult basic ed and continuing education, as well as recognizing how important it is to invest in those early childhood. So we put a lot of money into early childhood, as well as child care, knowing that our parents, and as you might have heard early on, I have 2 young granddaughters, and I see the joy that they bring our family, but also that financial stress and the lack of childcare opportunities for my daughters when they were starting to look for childcare for their children. But we also put quite a bit of money into American Indian education aid, 12.9 million in 2024, and then another 14.7 million increase, so that our school districts, our charter schools, tribal contract schools can operate an American Indian education program and expand on the form or the way that our Native kids educate very, very best. We also added $15 million, and then $15 million in the tails for Native language revitalization grants. Three things really that were really important that Senator or Representative Keeler and I have worked on for a long time is the prohibition of mascots, Native mascot use without tribal permission. We were able to allow our students to now wear like an eagle feather or some kind of regalia on their graduation day, and then also the ability for our students to carry and wear tobacco, sacred tobacco. So those are some of the things within our American Indian ways that we have been able to make a difference in education. But the higher education bill was really incredible because, of course, we now made it tuition free for students families who meet that income level, but again, made the difference for our American Indian kids by providing supplemental assistant grants, American Indian scholar tuition and help in that way, emergency fund for our colleges. But I think what was really also important is the investment in our increased teachers of color and Indigenous comprehensive bill. And Heather, mentioned this as well, or illustrated the fact that a lot of our kids, whether they're Native or not, don't see teachers that look like them, that speak their language, that have the same life experience, understand the historic trauma. And so those investments in the increasing teachers of color across higher ed, as well as all the other levels of education were and are a huge investment. So I mean, I could go on and on about all the good work that we did in the education area, but I think the investments in ethnic studies, in some of the other ways to support our LGBTQ communities, I think in the long run is going to make such a positive side effect or consequence to our society as a whole.
Can I add one more thing on that? On the higher ed piece, we actually, so our tribal colleges used to not get funded from the state at all. And, being in Moorhead and being directly engaged in higher education, before I was elected, I kind of always wondered why the tribal colleges, which are on my side of the state, Red Lake, Leech Lake, and White Earth all have tribal colleges, why Bemidji and MSUM and Moorhead weren't utilizing them more as these funnel schools, for paths to education and economic growth in tribal nations. And so it's interesting how many times I've shown up at tables and have said, why don't we do this? And the response has always been, well, we've never done that before. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So how do we do that now? And so one of the things we were able to do is establish a baseline foundation of $1 million for operations costs for each of those tribal colleges, which is huge. What they will do with $1 million, and I'm not even going to talk about how much money we give to the university, or the MnSCU systems, but it will go a long ways. They've been able to hire faculty. They've been able to hire financial aid, like advisors to help And they've really been able to expand some of their programming. And so it's that I think is so great because it's just another step in that education chain that we really need to make accessible.
Yeah. And I think this happened before Representative Keeler joined us in the House. But back in the day, so Minnesota has 4 BIE schools, Bureau of Indian Education schools, and the federal government has the responsibility for fully funding those schools, and of course they never have. And so those schools were in terrible shape. I mean, the physicalness, the supplies, the curriculum, the pay for teachers was terrible. And of course, everybody was saying, oh, those BIE schools, their graduation rate is awful. Their reading rates, all of these things are terrible. Well, they didn't have the resources to do that. So when I was in the House, well, actually, it happened within the Dayton administration, but Dayton decided that he would equalize that funding. Let's say that every kid gets $4,000 in Minnesota towards education. And those kids were maybe receiving $2,500 if they were lucky from the federal government. So Dayton decided to equalize that and bring it up to what every other student is receiving. And we'd have to go back every year and ask for that money. And we were able to eventually make that permanent funding, just as Rep. Keeler is saying, what an incredible difference, even though it seems like a small amount. What they were able to do in a very, very short time in making their buildings more attractive and safe, attracting quality teachers, bringing in the elders, their graduation rates increased like crazy. Drug use, teen pregnancy went down. And it just goes to show how these really targeted investments in places within our Indian communities really pay off in the end. And we're seeing more and more kids complete their high school graduation, go on to secondary education, and now we're reaping the benefits because we're seeing leaders in every area across the state from our Indigenous community, as well as they're filling the gaps of workers and those sort of things in their own community. So both of these, all of these things build on each other, and it's just so rewarding for myself, at least, to be able to be in a place where we can champion a lot of these good things.
Yeah, that is so exciting, and to spell out maybe one part of that on the higher education now. So and I want to make sure I have this correctly. So as I understand it, for a student that's an enrolled member here in Minnesota, that if you want to go on to higher education, that you are able to have that paid for. Is that correct? Maybe you want to expand it. I may not be getting it quite correct, so I want to, please correct me, Representative Keeler or Senator Kunesh on that point there. So there's that access to higher education point.
Yeah, absolutely. Prior to this year, if our Native kids, or if you are a descendant of a Native person and you can kind of prove that you were, those students could go to the University of Minnesota Morris tuition free. My son did that. I have nieces and nephews that took advantage of that. My brother is right now, he's an adult learner, but he's up there enrolled in a program up there. And so what we did is we expanded that across the University of Minnesota system. So it's a tuition free. And then we also were able to provide some scholarships to help with some of the other expenses that go along with that.
Keeping in mind, in our university systems now, we also have the North Star Promise, which says if you make less than $80,000 a year, you get tuition too. And so a lot of these, stacking on top of each other, really, again, make, I think, higher ed really accessible. I've been saying for a long time, education needs to be an opportunity for everybody, not just a privilege for some. And I think we really did a lot of work to make that a reality.
Yep.
Expanding on that, Representative Keeler, talk more about the North Star Promise, what that does. I mean, that is really an investment in in social mobility and equity and allowing people to achieve their full potential. So if your family has an annual income of $80,000 or less, that means for all students in Minnesota that it provides for tuition freeze. Am I correct in that, or let me know if I'm not quite getting that right, Pop? Please, clarify that North Star promise, because it's hugely exciting.
Yeah, that's it. I think the only thing I would add is it's last dollars in. And so what it is it just fills. So if you get, obviously you do your FAFSA, you get any of your Pell, you get any other funding, scholarships, things like that, that it just helps cover some of those last dollars in. So it's not like it's going to cover an entire tuition. Most students will get other support in other spaces. But to me, it's really exciting because, I sit on the border, and if anybody knows about Moorhead, we have 3 higher education institutions here on my side of the river alone. We have M State, which is our community college. We have Concordia, our private college, and then we have MSUM Moorhead, our university. And then I have NDSU literally across the bridge. And, we get a lot of the kids from this side of the state leave and go to NDSU because that's their bread and butter. They really market to those kids. We're more of a rural type community. There's a big agriculture, desire out here. And so I like that we've been creative to think about ways to keep our students in Minnesota. And how do we, because we know if we educate them and provide them really neat opportunities here, it increases the likelihood that they'll stay, that they'll have families, that they'll grow their businesses, and that they'll help, grow what we see the future of Minnesota. And so from a border city community with a lot of higher education components, it's working out really lovely on our behalf, because I don't know if you saw the North Dakota, some of the North Dakota legislators were really trying to push to go back to a special session because they knew this was going to make a big difference, especially in a time that we know enrollment is declining in higher education already, just because of change in nature and demographics across the border anyways. And so I think it's great. I think the one thing we're going to have to do is really talk about it. The thing I've learned in my 3 years being a legislator is we do really fantastic things, and we put money into spaces that then about. They don't know how to access them. They don't know that they're out there. And so just making sure that we continue to spread that word around Minnesota so that we can try to keep more of our kids here, because, Senator Kunesh is doing a lot of work putting these investments in our K-12 system, to become outstanding students. We want them in our higher ed systems and become professionals. Like it's an ongoing chain, like I said.
Yeah.
There have been a couple questions in the chats here. Maybe if someone would like to talk, Senator Kunesh, if you talk more about the Bureau of Indian Education, the BIE schools, and that system. If you talk a little bit more about that and how that fits into the education system.
Sure. So these are Bureau of Indian Education, and they were schools that were established as part of treaty agreements across the country, actually. And they're always found on reservation land. Onamia, Bina, where's the other ones? I'd have to look those up. They are schools that are funded by, they're sort of an independent school district unto themselves. And oftentimes there is some animosity towards them because they don't necessarily report to the state of Minnesota. They don't fall under our public school system per se, though they are our kids, whether they're Native kids or non-Native kids, because they are often open to any community kid to attend there. And as they were established, they've continued to exist, but our federal government just doesn't keep up with it. Like a lot of things that they don't keep up with, like our special ed subsidy, cross subsidy, our EL cross subsidy, those sort of things. And so they are schools that are kind of, they're a public school. They do take all of the same coursework or follow the standards within our state, but they're able to really create a unique way, a unique approach. And a lot of our schools that really serve our Native kids in the best way incorporate the community, they incorporate the culture, the language, elders that come in and maybe sit with the kids, work with the kids, teach them, you know, the language and some of the skills of beading or understanding the significance of why we smudge and why the sweat lodges are so important, and you know those pieces of those nuggets of wisdom along you know the goals and the viewpoints of our Indigenous communities. And so they kind of they work within the public school system, but they aren't really a public part of our public, like we don't control it. They have their own principal, they have their own superintendent, and but they're thriving. And with just that small investment, we've seen some really great things. My education committee is taking a tour across Minnesota. We've had a few days already visiting different schools, and we will be visiting a couple of the BIE schools just to see and talk to them and let them know that we know they're there and we support them in the best way that we can. But I'm really hoping to learn a lot about how we can continue to incorporate them into our general education system. And I want that to come from them. I want that to be coming from their voice and not sort of a top-down situation.
Can I jump in? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Please, yes. Please.
So in my life, I'm an educator, right? And sometimes one thing I've learned is that when Kunesh and I and the Indigenous Caucus get together, we say things that we just kind of assume everybody knows. And so I want to just take a minute because I'm not sure who's on this call. And if I could just take us back a minute to kind of just foundationally set the ground of what treaties are and what treaty obligations are and why that plays into education. And so the first thing is I want to make sure that we all know and understand that 100% of Minnesota is ceded treaty territory land. And I really encourage all of you to know what territory you reside in, because that matters. I sit in the 1851 treaty territory, which is the treaty territory of Travers, which is the Dakota Nations, which is really powerful for me because those are my people. But it's good for you to know what land you're on, especially as groups of people who care, about stewarding the land and the water and making sure we protect our relatives. It goes back to understanding that history. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution says that treaties are the law of the land. In a time when, we were building the Constitution, the words were very literal, right? And so the treaty obligations are a government to government contract. It's an agreement. Often what we've seen and what having Senator Kunesh and others at the table with is we've been able to remind the state government that our tribal nations and these treaty responsibilities are a government to government conversation. It's not that the state oversees the tribes or that the state does that. Like, that's never been what this is. And so in exchange for the land that many of us and many of you are thriving off of, there is a responsibility that we get things from that, which include education, healthcare. That's why we have the Indian healthcare services, the right to hunt, fish, and gather. That's why, there's a lot of us that say we shouldn't need hunting licenses or fishing licenses. It's our treaty responsibility in exchange, our right to, in 1979, we passed the American Indian Religious Act, which means we have the right to practice our medicine now. And so I just wanted to kind of set the ground as Mary was giving all these really great things about what our schools are doing. I think it's always important to understand why they're there and why it's our obligation as elected officials under oath to obtain the responsibility of those government to government relationships. Yeah. I hope that was helpful.
That was tremendously helpful, Representative Keeler, because the BIE schools stem from those treaties, and it's that government to government relationship. And I perhaps should have started this off that we have 11 Native nations in the state of Minnesota that have that nation to nation relationship with the federal government here. Representative Keeler, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the tribal colleges some more on that, and what the Red Lake, White Earth, and Leech Lake tribal colleges, how the role that they provide as well?
Yeah, so there's 4 tribal colleges in the state. Fond du Lac is already getting state funded because of their accreditations that they have, and because they have a couple 4-year programs. So I did the 3 on my side of the state aren't funded just because they're on my side of the state. They're the only 3 in the state that aren't getting funded. You know what I mean? They're the only ones that are out there. We have 4 total. But no, I mean, they're great. And the thing that I think we learned is that they're not just for Native American students. Anybody can attend them. So they're also just great education hubs for greater Minnesota, especially in western side of Minnesota. But the coolest thing is Red Lake Nation College is actually building a site right across from the Viking Stadium. They bought that area. It's right along the train. It's really an easy access point for people from Little Earth to get there, because we know like 60% of Native Americans live off the reservation. And that's a whole other conversation as to why. But the point is that now we're putting an education hub right in the middle of like the urban Indian Mecca to then help educate our students in a way that looks and smells and resembles us. And so that's really exciting. We got bonding money for that. And again, some of that $1 million that we put into their programs, they were able to hire faculty and staff to fill some of those positions. But in a way that there was a whole time that boarding schools were alive and well, and the mission was to kill the Indian and save the man. And that was all through boarding school and education like systems. And I love that we are taking these steps back to taking our education systems back in the way that we learn and the way that we thrive, and that we have state partnership in investing in that. And so it feels really cool that in a time like my uncles were taken to boarding schools, that now just a couple generations later, we're kind of taking our culture back through those education areas as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Representative Keeler. And expanding on something that you said there, I'd like to have Senator Kunesh respond to this, that Representative Keeler mentioned that 60% of the Native population lives off the reservation. And so in Minnesota, there were key investments in urban Native populations. Maybe want to expand on that. We had like about $14.5 million or so invested in about 7 or so projects in the urban context. I know that was a lot less than what was asked for. Maybe talk about some of those investments and what more there is to do in that area.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, we carried legislation this year to make improvements in some of the infrastructure, the support systems within our urban core here in Minnesota. And while we always, I'm glad that Representative Keeler has done a really good job of doing some of the education. But one of the reasons and why we have these urban cores both in Minneapolis and St. Paul, a lot of them is due to the relocation era. And that was an era when the U.S. government recognized and realized how expensive it is to keep all of these Indigenous people on reservations. I mean, they promised them health care and housing and education. They promised them food and farming utensils or training. And it proved to be very, very expensive because we survived. We didn't die off as they had hoped. And so they decided to encourage everybody to a lot of people in Native folks to leave the reservation and move into these urban cores like Minneapolis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Detroit, and basically promised to them the same thing: housing, jobs, education, healthcare, all of those things. And of course, they came, our ancestors came, our relatives came, and those support systems were not intact at the time, nor did they adequately over time provide those resources. And so once again, our folks were plunged into severe poverty and deprivation, and they clung together. And so we have the Franklin Avenue area, and then the east side in St. Paul. So again, recognizing how much we have not invested in those communities. We're able to get dollars to create and improve the American Indian Health Board over there, the American Indian Center. In St. Paul, we were able to give some of the final dollars to Wakan Tipi, which is down on the Mississippi River. It's a sacred site for the Dakota. It's like one of the birthplaces of the Dakota people that have been decimated over time. And just doing those investments, those really important investments within the community, to the organizations that have been doing those providing those resources and supporting the community for so long, but those buildings are falling apart. The Andai Young Center, which is the homeless shelter for Indian youth as well as adults, all of those things, when we're investing in the physicalness of those organizations, those nonprofits, again, we're going to see some really positive consequences come out for all of the community.
Thank you so much, Senator Kunesh. Both of you have done a lot of work on the missing, murdered and missing Indigenous women's space there. Talk about your work in this area and why it's so important. So maybe Representative Keeler, if you want to start off, and then Senator Kunesh.
Okay, I feel like that's backwards, but I will start, and then I'm going to let Senator Kunesh wrap up, because I guess I'm going to tell more of a story, because that's what I do. So I remember in my community, shortly after I had my son, Savannah went missing, and she was 8 months pregnant. And this has happened in my life a lot, right? Like family members, cousins, friends go missing from parties, and or not parties, but like coming home from the bus at school, or just walking home from different places. Like, I think we've all known somebody or have experienced some sort of attempted abduction. And it really, in my education timeframe, I learned over and over that data matters and the story matters. And if you don't tell the story and you don't collect the data, it continues to tell us as Indigenous women that we're invisible. And so when you looked at the national database of who was missing, there was never a way to indicate who the Native women were. And then we really started to dig into the phone calls when missing persons reports would come in urban Indian communities. And, dispatchers would try to say, well, no, you need to contact their tribal nation. And now all of a sudden you have to go back to your home tribe and they have to help find you. And, I always knew that there were those barriers, but I actually saw it play out when we were in, our community was in mass devastation around trying to find Savannah, and we just weren't getting a lot of the help. And I remember kind of feeling like we have to do so much more. And Senator Kunesh was really part of the conversation of launching the task force. And it kind of gave me this glimpse of hope, right? That there's somebody at the legislature that is feeling the same things that we're feeling in our community and is helping to create a space for us to talk about it. And so the task force was already developed. And then when I got elected and came on, then I just helped review what the task force had given us. And then that's when we invested in the office, which I'll let Senator Kunesh give updates on. And then the coolest thing is that now we're going to have a license plate, because we know that often we have to be creative on how we fund offices, and especially in an office around murdered and missing Indigenous relatives, which tells you we're already been invisible for how long. We would be easy to unfund if we ever had to. We wanted to be real creative in ways that we could continue to fund this office. And so we're going to have MMIR license plates, and we really encourage everybody to get them. And one of the reasons is, this does help fund the office. They help fund searches, researchers. There's a whole lot of other things. But, from my lens, I get targeted a lot being an Indigenous woman who drives and has my sage and my sweetgrass and my car. I will absolutely be driving around with an MMIR license plate on my car but a form of allyship is making sure that you all drive around in them too. So it's not just Native people driving around with these, because what a lot of people will tell you is you can get tribal tribal license plates. When you leave the res and you start going to places like Moorhead or Fargo or other communities, it is a tell of who's most likely in that vehicle. And so the hope is that, one, you find this important enough that you want to help us fund it, and you all want to drive around with these really cool license plates. And also it kind of offsets some of the fear that some of us have that this would create a targeting opportunity on some of our vehicles. So I'll pass it on to Senator Kunesh for the rest of all that.
Thanks, Rep. So similar to Rep Keeler's experience, when Savannah LaFontaine Great Wind went missing up in the Dakotas, and the horror of it all, and the media didn't really pick up on it until they found her body and the baby had been cut from her womb. The media all of a sudden, of course, the sensational story, let's hear about it. But Canada had just released their preliminary national report on their MMIW. Savannah, this whole tragedy with Savannah happened. I was a new legislator in the House and thought, what can I do? What should I do? And so with community, we put together the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force and introduced it in 2018. But we didn't pass it until 2019 when the DFL took the majority. We did have 100% bipartisan support for it. And so it passed. And of course, the task force was interrupted by COVID, but we continued to do the work that we needed to accomplish that task force by providing opportunities for community and everybody to meet via Zoom. And then came up with about 24 recommendations that we wanted to implement to ensure that we were going to be addressing this historic tragedy of our missing and murdered, not just the women and the girls, but the men and the boys in our Two-Spirit as well. And so the very first recommendation was to create a permanent office of the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And we did that. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, first in the nation to create that. And then, of course, recognizing that this is not just unique to Native women or Native communities. Representative Ruth Richardson and I created the Missing and Murdered African American Women's Task Force, and they're kind of following the same steps as us. So we have this office, and as Rep Keeler mentioned, the license plate, but we also, inspired by the city of Duluth, created a reward fund within the MMIR office where people would be able to donate, organizations, all kinds of different, tribes, anybody could donate to create this reward fund to not only continue the work, because we know how precarious governmental agencies are, but also to be able to maybe tease out some facts or information on past cases. And then that brings us to the license plate. Yes, I had an inspiration on my drive to the Capitol one day when I was looking at all these unique license plates. We should get a MMIR license plate. And so we did that. And this is the work that we will continue to do to address the violence and the tragedy that continues. I was just up in Bemidji. We did a search for a young woman that's been missing for over a year now. And that was orchestrated by the MMIR office. It was the first one that they were able to bring together the way that they did. I think it was, while they did not find the young woman, we were able to get out there and get more information out there and bring a lot of different resources together, which will now be the prototype for future searches. So that's what we're up to.
Thank you so much, Senator Kunesh and Representative Keeler, on that important point here. We have a question in the chat here. It's sort of, I'll generalize it, but the question would be like, to be better informed and better educated and better allies. What how would you recommend to non-native people to go about it? What resources should we do? How should we go about it, and what resources are out there to make us better informed, better educated, and better allies?
We do a tribal state relations training. I know that all of the legislators just went down and did that, and they host that. It's through the Department of Transportation. I know that that's designed for like agencies and organizations, but I mean, I think there are good groups out there that are really trying to do, education and maybe try to tap into some of those.
And and I just I was just at that tribal training the last 2 days. It was incredible. It was really profound. But I'm not offering to everybody and anybody, but I kind of am. I'm often asked to go speak about the MMIR situation, and so I do, whether it's via Zoom or in person. But start educating yourself. There is so much good information out there just by Googling it, or contacting some of the most reliable organizations that deal with these issues. Chris, you said you used to work for the Indian Land Tenure. Yeah, I mean, we've got a bill coming up with them as well. It could be pretty profound. But there are powwows across the state all the time, and those are open to the public. And you might not be comfortable, or you might not feel like you are, you're welcome there, but indeed you are. Reaching out to the tribes is really important. Every school district, if you have 20 or more students, they should have a American Indian liaison for the district, and then working with the students in the building. Find out what they're doing within your school district. There's so many nonprofit organizations that address our communities, like Migizi, the Indian Women's Resource Center. I mean, there's just so much out there. You really have to be proactive. If you're saying, what can I do? What do you want to do? What do you really want to do? And then start reaching out to different folks and different organizations to say, I have this skill or this interest. How can I be of help? Whether it's your money or your time or resources, or your participation. It really isn't something that people should have to come to you and ask you to do. You should be more than willing to jump in and provide those things. And it's all blurry.
I know. I was like, so the Red Lake Nation has Warrior Nation. It's a book that they sell that's actually like their own history. Red Lake Nation is really unique. And so there's books like that, but there's also just like kids books too. I mean, sometimes kids books are the best place to start. We Are Water Protectors is also one that I really like, or Night Flying Women. Those are just kind of like, I mean, we're storytellers too. And so there's that. A couple movies that I always try to tell people to watch is Wind River. That's actually my mom's tribe. But it's a really, I think the movie starts to touch on the MMIR epidemic and how it really plays out. And so, then All My Relations is a podcast that is on fairly regularly. And so hopefully some of those things, attending events, but then also sometimes people just want some of those education opportunities. Stringing Rosaries is by Denise Lagimore, which is stories about boarding schools in our area, and they're real life stories from boarding school survivors. So hopefully maybe some of those resources you can look into as well.
Yeah, Louise Airdridge has her bookstore in Minneapolis, Birch Bark Books. And I mean, you will find everything that is, authentically Native literature in that bookstore. And they often have a lot of good book talks. I'm going to make a plug for my cousin who just published a book. It's called The Council of Dolls. And she went all the way to the top. She's been nominated for the National Book Awards Her name is Mona Susan Power, and it was a hard book for me to read because there's a lot of my family history in there, even though the characters are fictional, but there's so much good literature out there now, and especially just as Rep. Keeler said, picture books, young adult books, adult level books around our Indigenous being. Those are real. I mean, you can read for hours and hours, days and days, months and months, and not run out of really good resources.
Thank you so much for those recommendations, both experientially by attending powwows and the reading here and going to Birch Bark Books and educating ourselves there. We are at the end of our time, and I am so grateful that you were generous in sharing your time, Senator Kunesh and Representative Keeler. We are so very grateful. We are very fortunate to have you representing all of us in the Minnesota Legislature. I'm going to put in a quick note that we are following this meeting with a Prove It First Coalition meeting, and I'll ask my colleague Maggie if you maybe drop the Zoom link for people that may want to attend that. I'm on the topic of water protectors that Representative Keeler and Senator Kunesh are part of. We are part of the effort to pass a Prove It First bill in Minnesota that would protect all of Minnesota's water from sulfide mining. And we have monthly meetings that elected officials, citizens, and organizations attend. And our next one is coming up in about 30 seconds now. And so if Maggie, there's the link in there for those of you that have the opportunity to attend. We're all are welcome for it. We welcome additional voices. And so again, turning back to the topic at hand here, Indigenous Peoples Day should not just be a day, it should be a lifetime. And as an organization, Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness wants to have genuine allyship and be authentic and learn and look at the gaps that we have and acknowledge those and be better. So all I can say is thank you so very much from our hearts here. So thank you, Representative Keeler. Thank you, Senator Kunesh.
Wopila for giving us this opportunity.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.